Have you determined who wrote the ransom note?
Sources tell us in his report, summarized by detectives in the June presentation of evidence, Foster identified the writer of the ransom note as Patsy Ramsey.
Okay, but that's not what he said in his letter to Patsy. In his letter to Patsy, he said, the ransom note appears to have been written by a young adult with an adolescent imagination. Where does that come from? So who exactly did Professor Foster think wrote the note besides Patsy?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. We concluded our last analysis of Professor Donald Foster's contribution, he's from Vassar College, to the Ramsey case in terms of his assessment of the ransom note, with him writing to Patsy, assuring her, you can be vindicated, you will be vindicated, with will being underlined. Now let's jump to the remainder of the letter. I've also looked closely at police disclosures concerning the unpublished ransom note. My study of the incomplete transcript leads me to believe that you did not write it. Now, he's saying that he has seen disclosures, elements of the ransom note released, and he's based his analysis on that, on those elements, which, as you can imagine, is not something you can really do. Does anyone know the date when the full text of the JonBenet Ramsey ransom note was finally published in the news, in newspapers? If you do, put up your hand. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button. By the way, I do want to encourage you all to view and absorb all of the information around these handwriting analysts to get the full insight into the whole handwriting narrative, the ransom note narrative. If you only watch some of them, you're not going to get a comprehensive picture. And so if you want real insight, you are going to need to use your attention spans and take note and pay attention to certain things that perhaps you might not normally pay attention to. One of those people is Sina Wong. And the question we really want to ask is, if all of these experts were dismissed, how come the grand jury seemed to reject the idea that an intruder wrote the ransom note? In other words, which person convinced the grand jury about the authorship of the ransom note? That's really what we're getting at. So I do recommend you watch the video I did on Sina Wong. We'll be doing other experts as well, such as Gideon Epstein, Chet Ubowski. All of it is really important. So once again, if you find that interesting, worthwhile, please do hit the subscribe button. If you're finding this analysis insightful, it's taking a lot of effort to put it together, to research it. So please show your appreciation by hitting the thanks button, and let's get started. So, did you know the full text of the JonBenet Ramsey ransom note was published in the Denver Post on September 3rd, 1997? That's more than 3 months after Professor Foster wrote this letter to Patsy saying, based on what I know from the ransom note, I know you didn't write this. Up until this point, selective excerpts had been published in the media of the ransom note, but not the ransom note as a whole. Now let's jump to the remainder of the letter. I have also looked closely at police disclosures concerning the unpublished ransom note. My study of the incomplete transcript leads me to believe that you did not write it, and that police are wasting their time by trying to prove that you did. Unless police have misreported the note, it appears to have been written by this is interesting, it appears to have been written by a young adult with an adolescent imagination overheated by true crime literature and Hollywood thrillers, and by someone having prior issues with you and your husband. Now, do you think when he refers to a young adult, he's referring to Burke Ramsey? Do you think when he refers to someone with an adolescent imagination overheated by true crime literature and Hollywood thrillers, do you think he's talking about Burke Ramsey? I don't. When he refers to someone having prior issues with you and your husband, who could that be a reference to? Bear in mind, Patsy was John's second wife and he had kids with another mother. There is another mother in the story as well, Lucinda Ramsey. And so it does make you wonder what or where was Foster's bias leaning before actually even seeing the note. Anyway, he goes on to say, the near universal belief among ordinary Americans, a view encouraged by police behavior, is that you wrote the letter to protect the person who murdered your daughter. Then he says, I find that impossible to believe. What makes this document really quite interesting, quite fascinating, remember this note was written in real time just a few weeks after the Ramseys had condescended to give their first proper police interviews. That happened in late April 1997. Well, it's interesting to note what headlines are being highlighted here by Foster, someone who's very well read, in June 1997. He goes on to write, as you may know, and it pains me to say this, your reputation has been dragged through the mud on the World Wide Web in thousands of posts on half a dozen chat boards and in household conversation from coast to coast. So has Burke's. One vocal minority has steadfastly accused Burke of killing John Bonet. It has been supposed, though wholly incredible, that Burke is a disturbed boy who killed his sister out of jealousy and that you and John are covering for him. It has even been noted that the verb to Burke means to strangle someone. And some of the things said about you are worse yet, too vile to repeat. Now, what makes these comments by Foster quite interesting is you'll remember that on December 26th, and for at least the next 2 weeks, even beyond that, Burke Ramsey was so invisible in terms of the Ramsey narrative, he might have been a peripheral figure himself. It's also not clear who he's referring to when he refers to a vocal minority. I suspect this was chatter on online forums, not news or even tabloid reports, not in 1997. And I think Foster's reference to chatboard discussion seems to confirm this. Because he writes, and it has been suggested in some chatboard discussion that the accusations will stick, that you will be blamed for the killing after you are gone. If the true killer is not revealed, Burke, too, will live his life under a cloud of suspicion. I'm sure you have already thought through these horrific problems. They will not go away by doing nothing. And that concludes the second page. And then he really presents himself as the solution to Patsy's conundrum, the legal and public quandary that she finds herself in. And that then brings us to the third and final page, where he writes, last May, I wrote to someone close to the investigation with information that ought to have been investigated. I tried again. Both offers were met with absolute indifference. I've since come to think that there may be something quite rotten within the investigative bureaucracy.
Letters, notes, even files police retrieved from the family computer.
My experience with the Boulder detectives was that they were entirely professional in their work, that they were dedicated to the case.
So you see, Foster had glowing praise for the Boulder PD when interviewed, but that's not something he seems to convey to Patsy, though, is it? When Foster writes, I think there may be something wrong with the investigative bureaucracy, I don't think he's wrong, but I'm not sure that rottenness lay on the side of the Boulder PD. You may recall in Detective Steve Thomas's resignation letter, he didn't blame any of his fellow cops for being rotten. Instead, he blamed the DA's office for frustrating the investigation. Remember, he wrote, I believe the district attorney's office is thoroughly compromised. And then when one looks at the tabloid narrative in October 1997, which came out a few months after Foster's letter to Patsy, remember that was June 1997. Look at this article from the National Examiner, October 1997, just one example. It was one tabloid accusing the DA's office of being compromised, to use Thomas's word. Inside that tabloid, DA in cahoots with Ramsey's lawyer. They're showing them all the evidence. There's actually some very interesting analysis there on Greg McCreary, the FBI agent who's quoted in this particular article. It's beyond the ambit of this analysis to revisit the accusations against Alex Hunter, and let's face it, the tabloids are hardly a font of truth, but it is interesting that even Foster seemed to be aware of a malaise on the investigative side as early as the middle of 1997, and weren't those intuitions well-founded ultimately? You'll notice Professor Foster next tries to assure Patsy that with his nous as an analyst, he also has incredible insight into the case from various unnamed sources. That may be, but one can't help feeling as if he's sort of telling Patsy what he thinks she may be susceptible to, that she might engage with him simply to ask, tell me what you know. Anyway, let's go back to the letter. Professor Foster writes, I've gathered a lot of information about this case on my own from a variety of sources without being officially retained by anyone. Hint, hint. I do not wish to intrude where my counsel is not wanted, but I am ready to assist you. At the very least, I think I can exonerate you from a presumption of guilt with respect to the ransom note. I may also be able to assist you in seeking justice for John Bonet. So you'll note he very specifically offers his assistance to exonerate Patsy in terms of the ransom note. It does raise the question, why did Foster offer his services to the Ramseys first and to the cops second? It's possible, of course, that he genuinely felt for Patsy and genuinely felt the ransom note was written by an adolescent, certainly based on the limited access that he'd had to it in the beginning. But it's also possible and even likely that at that early stage, given what was known, he believed Patsy, genuinely believed Patsy. But it may also be that he knew the Ramseys would pay a lot more for his expertise than the cops. Except then he goes on to write this. I do not want money from you now or ever. I just want to stop this person from killing again and to exonerate those who are innocent. So he says he doesn't want any money. Of course, weighing in on a case like this, if you're a document examiner or a linguist, that can make or break your career. And arguably, it made Sina Wong's career, because the Ramsey case was really, I think, the first case she really took on. She went from a complete unknown to working a bunch of cases in short order after the Ramsey case. So what may have been the prize here was the celebrity aspect, the high-profile nature, the almost guarantee that if you associated with this case, well, America would know your name kind of thing. They certainly got to know Sina Wong's name. Or the prize may have been to be simply allowed to strut your stuff. After all, if you are trained to analyze writing and text, what is a more glittering opportunity to make a contribution in this very specialized, very niche area than a case like this, with its confounding Magna Carta, the so-called War and Peace of ransom notes? Now, where Foster claims he has a pretty well-informed opinion of who the killer is and where he is hiding out, I feel he possibly loses Patsy's interest. I know he loses mine, because no matter which way you slice it, that feels like a dubious claim. Remember, John Mark Carr only came onto the scene almost 10 years later, so he definitely wasn't referring to him. So who do you think he was referring to? Because at this stage, like many people, he clearly had a working theory, didn't he? And he says as much when he says, I know a lot about what's going on behind the scenes on the internet and elsewhere. Some of it is deeply disturbing. While pursuing these leads, I wish to protect my own wife and children. I do not wish to be harassed by the PLA. And then he says, at this time, I cannot talk to police or attorneys, nor do I wish for it to be reported that I have even taken an interest in the case. Now that definitely makes one think, so it's not really about the celebrity aspect, perhaps. Anyway, he says, I think it's quite important for me to speak with you, preferably today or ASAP. I do have some questions for you which you may choose not to answer, and some distressing but highly pertinent information. And I think that may have to do with who he suspects actually did it. Someone closer to home than perhaps he thinks she is aware of. He says, I shall agree in advance to whatever restrictions you may wish to place on our conversation. My only request is that you keep our exchange absolutely private. I don't know whom I can trust, but I do feel quite sure that you were sincere when you said that you wish to expose the killer. In fact, I already have a pretty well-informed opinion about who killed your daughter and where he is hiding out. In his final paragraph to the 3-page letter, he writes, if you are willing to talk to me, please call me ASAP. You may call collect. Wow. Okay. I strongly prefer that you call me from your minister's office. Quite a lot of cloak and dagger going on here. He says, I urge you not to call from home on account of doubtful telephone security. Don't worry about the hour, anytime, night or day is okay. If I don't pick up, please leave a message and I'll call back. If you do not wish to speak with me or are afraid to do so or have reservations, please communicate those concerns to me through your minister. And then he wraps up writing, I respect your privacy. If you think I cannot help you, at least I tried. If you cannot make this phone call with a good conscience or without fear, then don't. And then he provides his phone number. And obviously, Patsy didn't phone him. And this letter, we actually have this letter because it was faxed from one of the investigators, I think, to the Ramseys or vice versa. What's also interesting is when the Ramseys received this letter, it was sent to their home in Charlevoix. So they were in Michigan at the time, not even in Atlanta, and obviously not in Boulder either.
The professor once discovered Shakespeare was the author of a centuries-old manuscript.
Now, if you remember what we dealt with on the first page where he says, I've never made a substantive error, that's at the bottom of the first page. Well, clearly his own assessment of the author of the ransom note seemed to be flexible. But what is interesting is the entire arc of Foster's career, where, for example, texts he attributed to Shakespeare, for example, were later found to belong to someone called John Ford. This happened as soon as 2002, just 5 years after his 3-page letter to Patsy. And so, according to Foster's own Wikipedia page, after considerable debate, Foster's theory was eventually rejected by other Shakespeare scholars. In 2002, Gilles Monserrat, a translator of Shakespeare into French, published an article arguing that the poem's true author wasn't Shakespeare, but was John Ford, a younger writer whose works Monserrat had also edited. Foster conceded that Monserrat had the better case in a post on Shakespeare listserv, saying, no one who cannot rejoice in the discovery of his own mistakes deserves to be called a scholar. Foster said that he had not previously analyzed Ford's works closely enough and had erroneously dismissed him as a possibility. Well, it seems in June 1997, Foster had also erroneously dismissed Patsy as a possible author of the ransom note, but it gets worse than that. After writing to Patsy and possibly before being hired by the police, Foster appeared to pivot towards an even more dubious position, believing John Ramsey's son was behind the murder, and presumably he was the adolescent author of the ransom note mentioned in this letter. And do you know now who that is a reference to? Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. Look out for the part 2 in our analysis on Sina Wong, where she provides specific instances, specific examples of similarities between Patsy's unrehearsed handwriting and the ransom note. That should be really worth watching, so look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.